pinned beneath twisted metal. His only chance to survive was to break free, before the flames devoured him. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. He couldn't have known the path that led him here, clattering inside that old livestock trailer with half-rusted walls and a floor stained dark from the hundreds of desperate animals that had come before him. He couldn't have guessed that, in the breath between one moment and the next, his life would hang in the balance. But the Mustang had sensed the dread for days, the stale air, the ominous quiet between the labored engine rumblings, the feeling that time was running out. His ears twitched at every unfamiliar sound, and his nostrils flared at every hint of cold, metallic tang. He was a prisoner, locked away, fed little, forced onto a road that rumbled beneath him like some colossal beast. Somewhere deep inside, he felt that the place they were taking him was the end of all light. He had once roamed free, mane lifted by the wind of a desert sunrise, hooves pounding a wild drumbeat across open plains. A life lived under the blazing sun, storms rolling in from distant mountains, and sweet grass swaying. All that had been stolen from him the day men on horseback and men in trucks forced him and his herd into a corral. The memory jabbed at him even now, loud shouts, the crack of whips, the sting of an electric prod. Panic had crushed them all into a swirling mass of sweat and fear. And from there, they had been sorted, separated, shoved into trailers that stank of fear, heading down unknown roads to unknown fates. Days of travel left him numb, vision bleary. But he still noticed the black eyes of the driver when the man opened the trailer door at rest stops, the lash of the rope, the jab of a stick. He could almost taste the man's impatience, as though he were just a hunk of meat to be processed. Something about the driver's tone and the way he barked curses into his phone told him that the end destination was no sanctuary. The Mustang had never felt so helpless, penned in with a half-dozen other horses, some too weary to even stand. Some coughed so violently he thought they might never stop. The tension hung like thunderclouds, heavy and electric. Night fell on a dangerous stretch of road. The driver seemed to be in a rush, pushing the truck and trailer faster, taking sharp turns as if outrunning something. The Mustang slid on the slick floor, his legs tangled in the frantic scramble of the others. Their eyes rolled white with terror. Wheels squealed against pavement, and for a heartbeat, the entire trailer seemed to tilt, defying gravity. Time slowed, and in that silent fraction of a second, he felt weightless, suspended in the gloom. Then reality crashed back with a violent jolt, metal shrieking, the trailer smashing through a crumpling guardrail. He was thrown to one side, slamming into the steel wall hard enough to make his vision spark. Another horse crashed into him, thrashing, whinnying in terror. They plummeted down the ravine, the entire rig shaking and rattling. Grating, ripping sounds cut through the air as rocks tore at the undercarriage. His heart thundered in his chest. Dust and debris choked his nostrils. He braced himself for an impact he sensed was coming but couldn't fully imagine. Then it hit. The trailer lurched, toppling onto its side, slamming into boulders in a sickening, bone-rattling crash. He tumbled across the twisted interior, metal edges tearing at his flesh. The roar and screech of the collision drowned out the panicked screams of the other horses. When the trailer finally groaned to a halt, everything was darkness and the faint moan of wind. He lay twisted among the bodies of the others, pinned down by a dead weight that refused to budge. Dazed, battered, he blinked, trying to see something in the absolute black, breathing in short, ragged gasps. The stench of gasoline hit him first, a sharp pungency that clawed at his throat. The air tasted like fear and fire, a cruel combination that turned his lungs raw. He realized the entire trailer was battered and partially folded in on itself, creating a torturous cage of splintered boards and twisted metal. Bits of the night sky poked through jagged gaps, and a few faint stars blinked down. He could hear the other horses, some alive, some not, kicking feebly or lying completely still. A flicker of orange in the corner of his eye made his heart seize. Flames. The truck's engine had torn open on impact, and fuel was spreading along the ground like a black river. The spark of an exposed wire was enough to start the blaze, and now tongues of fire lapped at the battered remains of the trailer. If he didn't move, if he didn't find a way out, he would share the fate of so many that had never made it home. With every bit of strength left in his battered body, he pushed and twisted. A dead weight pressed against his side, a lifeless horse pinned to him, one of those that never survived the tumble. The Mustang's muscles trembled as he forced his legs to brace. A grunt, a groan, another sharp jab of pain from his own injuries. Slowly, the corpse shifted enough for him to scramble free from beneath it. His flank burned, blood matting his coat. He could barely stand. Every breath was a serrated blade in his chest. Thick smoke billowed into the remains of the trailer. The fire hissed, devouring the broken boards. Heat rolled across his skin. He could almost feel the flames licking closer, as if beckoning him to a swift end. Panic churned in his chest, but a deeper instinct kicked in, an instinct older than memory, the primal drive to live. He stumbled forward, bashing his shoulder into the twisted wall, searching for any opening. Sparks rained down, stinging his eyes. The stench of burning flesh and hair told him the others had no time left either. He reared, slamming his hooves against the metal beam. The entire structure shuddered, but nothing gave. He kicked again, harder, letting the echo of the impact ring through the night. A faint shriek of metal gave him hope. He pounded at it, ignoring the shrieking pain in his own limbs. Each collision jolted fresh agony into his battered body. His mind screamed at him to stop, but he had no choice. Either he broke out, or the flames would claim him. Finally, a twisted section of the trailer groaned. A gap widened, letting in a sliver of orange light that shimmered like hellfire. He shoved his head through, ignoring the jagged edges of metal that cut into his skin. The opening was too small, but he kept pushing, thrashing, forcing it wider. The fire was spreading faster now, igniting old straw and dried dung. An explosion erupted from the truck's fuel tank, shaking the ravine with a thunderous roar. The shockwave nearly knocked him off his feet again, but he wedged his shoulders through the gap. A final thrust of his hind legs sent him sliding over the ragged metal. He stumbled out into the night, collapsing onto the rocky ground. The air out here was just as ominous, but at least he wasn't inside that death trap anymore. Flames rose high behind him, painting the canyon walls in a macabre glow. He lay panting, every muscle in his body screaming. Blood dripped from numerous gashes, and his coat was singed where the fire had gotten too close. But he was alive, a small miracle on a night that felt devoid of mercy. He tried to stand. His legs wobbled, almost giving out under his weight. Still, he managed to right himself, muzzle brushing against the cold earth. The smell of charred wood and scorched metal hung heavy. Flickers of light revealed other shapes scattered around the crash site, some motionless, some struggling in vain. The Mustang let out a low, trembling neigh, unsure if it was meant as a cry for help or a lament for those who wouldn't rise again. A sudden gust of wind swept down the ravine, carrying embers and sparks. It whipped his mane, stinging the tender cuts along his neck. He had no choice but to push onward, to find higher ground or some semblance of shelter. This place was doomed. The entire wreckage was engulfed in savage flames. If any horse or human had survived inside, they would have to escape on their own. He lacked the strength to go back in there, and the inferno was becoming an unapproachable wall of heat. He limped away from the trailer, one step at a time, each movement a fresh wave of agony. His left foreleg seemed to be the worst. It refused to bear weight without a sharp bolt of pain shooting up to his shoulder. But he pressed on. The ravine's walls loomed tall, their rock faces broken by boulders and precarious ledges. The only way out would be a difficult climb, or a perilous search for a gentler slope. Yet the Mustang couldn't simply remain at the bottom, not with the fire raging behind him and smoke filling the air like a suffocating blanket. Darkness swallowed him as he hobbled farther from the blaze. Each time he paused to rest, his body threatened to collapse. But he couldn't allow that. If he lay down now, he might never find the will to stand up again. The gravel crunched beneath his hooves, the slope tilting upward in a taunting angle. With no company but the flicker of the inferno behind him, he pressed on. The wind carried faint sounds, eerie and distant, half lost in the roar of flames. It might have been the cry of another horse, or maybe just the ghosts of this canyon. He had no time to parse it. Survival demanded his full attention. Every sense remained on high alert, searching for the next threat. His ears swiveled at the faintest noise, a falling stone, a sudden rustle in the sparse brush, a distant echo of what could have been the call of an animal. In a place like this, even the shadows might harbor danger. He pressed his muzzle to the ground, sniffing for water or some sign of a path forward. The earth was dry, the dust thick. One step after another, he climbed over loose rocks and around patches of spiny shrubs. His breath was ragged, and the taste of blood filled his mouth from a cut on his lip. Yet he continued, driven by a singular, unyielding force, to live. Eventually, the glow of the fire dropped behind a bend in the ravine's twisting walls. The darkness here was impenetrable, relieved only by a pale smudge of moonlight peering over the cliff's edge. He paused, chest heaving, legs quivering. An occasional stone rolled beneath his trembling hooves, skittering down into the unseen depths below. The cold night air did little to soothe him. Instead, it felt like 1,000 tiny daggers pressing into his open wounds. His ears pricked at the sound of distant thunder. Clouds must be gathering overhead, hiding the stars, turning this canyon into an abyss. He hoped the storm might bring rain to quench the blazing wreckage, but also feared it might turn the ravine into a torrent if the water came down hard. Either way, he had to keep moving. Climbing became a grueling task, each lunge upward a test of will. Loose pebbles rolled away under his weight, forcing him to scramble for traction. His injured legs screamed with every step, and more than once he nearly slid backward. But somewhere at the top, there might be open space or a path back to the plains. The memory of those plains, golden grass, wide horizons, fueled him. He had been taken from them, but if luck was on his side, he might see them again. As the night stretched on, exhaustion warped the hours. He lost track of how many times he slipped or collapsed to his knees, how many times he forced himself back up. The wind howled, scouring the canyon walls, carrying the smell of smoke and damp earth. When he finally reached a narrow ledge, he paused to survey the way ahead. The ledge wound along the cliff face, and though it looked treacherous, it seemed like the only route. With no choice, he set his trembling hooves onto it, hugging the rock wall as best he could. Pebbles clattered off the edge, disappearing into the darkness below. The hush that followed each tumble felt like a warning, as if the canyon itself wanted to devour anything that strayed too far from safety. He inched along, teeth bared in a silent grimace of pain. The rough stones scraped his flank, aggravating the cuts he'd suffered in the wreck. But he pressed on, for the alternative was to surrender, to let the canyon claim him. And every fiber of his being refused to let that happen. As he rounded a corner, the path ahead collapsed in a tumble of rock. The small avalanche must have happened recently, perhaps shaken loose by the crash or the explosion. Large boulders and loose rubble barred the way. He lowered his head, despair threatening to crush him. There was no easy way forward, no easy way back. The Mustang's muscles quivered. Part of him wanted to simply lie down right there and let the darkness swallow him. Yet he knew if he gave in to that urge, he would never stand again. Bracing himself, he pawed at the edge of the rubble, testing for any stable foothold. The slope was steep, but maybe there was a path if he scrambled carefully. He decided to risk it, shifting his weight onto the shifting rocks. They skittered beneath him, and for a heart-stopping moment, he slid back, nearly losing his balance. A wave of panic shot through him, but he found some grip on a protruding stone. Heart pounding, he hauled himself forward one trembling step at a time. The climb became a battle of inches, every movement a potential disaster. Stones rolled away underfoot, plummeting into the abyss. His injured foreleg trembled, threatening to buckle. But the Mustang's spirit blazed, fueled by the unbreakable will of a wild horse who once roamed free. He would not die in this place. He would not meet his end so far from the open skies. Gathering every ounce of strength, he surged upward, ignoring the burning in his muscles. At last, the rubble gave way to firmer ground on the far side. He stood there, chest heaving, his coat drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. A glance behind revealed the path he had taken, a ragged scar of rock and darkness, no sign of the trailer wreck visible from this vantage. But the smell of smoke still lingered, carried on the wind, an ominous reminder of what he had escaped. He pushed on, hobbling along the ledge until it finally widened enough to be less precarious. The night stretched endlessly, and each passing moment felt borrowed. A strange quiet settled, broken only by the clatter of dislodged stones and his ragged breathing. The canyon felt alive, the darkness crowding in around him, pressing on his mind. He did not belong here. He needed open space, grass, water, the possibility of dawn. An eternity seemed to pass before he reached a gentler slope that led upward. Weariness sagged in his bones, and yet he climbed. He had to. No matter how battered, no matter how hopeless, he couldn't stop. The pang of hunger gnawed at his belly, and thirst burned in his throat, but these paled next to the blazing ache of every wound on his body. Muscles tight, one hoof in front of the other, he fought his way up. Finally, as if the canyon decided to grant him a reprieve, the slope leveled. Before him stretched a narrow plateau, a place where he could rest without fear of sliding to his doom. He nearly collapsed upon reaching it, trembling from exhaustion. His lungs pulled in the thin air, and for the first time since he freed himself from that twisted trailer, he felt a sliver of relief. It was fleeting, overshadowed by the knowledge of how dire his situation remained, but it was there. He stood, legs splayed for balance, head hanging, breath ragged. The ordeal had only begun. The Mustang sensed that more dangers lurked in this night, in the cold and the dark, with predators roaming these wild lands. But for a moment, he let himself be still. A faint moonbeam pierced the cloud cover, illuminating the steep walls of the canyon on one side and the endless drop on the other. The vastness of the night sky hinted at a freedom he could barely remember but desperately yearned to taste again. He closed his eyes, recalling the faint memory of a golden sunrise on an open plain. Wind in his mane, the thunder of countless hooves as his herd galloped in unison, hearts beating as one. That had been life. That had been joy. A sharp pang of longing rose in his chest, almost as painful as the physical wounds. But that memory also reminded him of why he had to continue, why every step forward was essential. He was not meant to be trapped in darkness. He was meant to run free. And so, though he trembled and bled, though his throat burned for water, he steeled himself to face whatever came next. The cold bit harder as the night deepened. A thin layer of frost began to form on the rocks, making them slick under his hooves. The stars overhead looked distant, cold lights in an indifferent sky. But he had survived one impossible moment. He would endure the rest. And so, with a final snort, the Mustang turned away from the ledge and limped deeper into the darkness, determined to find a way out of this jagged labyrinth alive. He pressed on, step after agonizing step, with only his own labored breathing and the faint whistle of wind for company. The night felt endless, but dawn would come. It had to. Through the haze of pain, he clung to that truth. Even in the face of devastation, even with the memory of the trailer's burning wreck haunting him like a living nightmare, dawn was inevitable, and with it, the possibility of a new beginning. He didn't know what lay beyond the canyon's walls. He didn't know if he would find friend or foe. But as long as he kept moving, he had a chance, however slim, to return to the freedom that had once defined his life. Step by step, the Mustang advanced, guided by the primal fear of death and the unyielding desire to live. Though alone and gravely wounded, he refused to fall. That refusal was all he had, and in this moment, it was enough. The darkness held its secrets close, offering no comfort, no easy answers. Yet, in the Mustang's pounding heart, in the trembling of his weary limbs, the defiance of a wild creature burned bright. He would not be extinguished. Not now. Not in this place. With the faint cry of the wind echoing like distant voices of his lost herd, he walked on, prepared to face whatever terror lurked ahead, determined to see another sunrise and feel the warmth of day on his battered body. Survival was all that mattered, and as long as he breathed, he would fight for it. He might have been destined for slaughter, for a cruel and unceremonious end, but fate had other plans this night. Though he knew nothing of mercy or second chances in the world of men, he sensed that something had changed in that moment of fiery chaos. Some door had opened, and even if it led him through a gauntlet of dangers, it was still a path to freedom. And for a horse whose spirit was forged in the wild, no price was too high for one more taste of that open range. He awoke to a faint glow in the sky, an early sign that dawn was on its way. He had not intended to sleep, but exhaustion had pulled him under like a rip current in the dark ocean of night. The ground beneath him was cold and unyielding, but it had supported his body while he rested for what must have been only an hour or two. Now, as the sky began to lighten from black to a deep cobalt, he slowly pushed himself upright, wincing at the fresh surge of pain. Every muscle complained, and the myriad cuts and bruises reminded him just how tenuous his survival was. Yet, in this half-light, he felt a spark of renewed determination. His breath fogged the crisp air. Somewhere overhead, a hawk screeched, announcing the impending sunrise. The world was about to awaken, and so was he, despite the agony that coursed through him. He needed water. His throat felt like it had been raked by razor blades. But water wouldn't come to him, so he needed to seek it. Digging deep for strength, he placed one hoof forward, then the next. The plateau stretched for a short distance before funneling into another narrow passage between towering walls of rock. Small clusters of scraggly plants clung to the cracks, offering little sustenance but still surviving against all odds. He eyed them with mild curiosity. Though he was a horse who grazed, these paltry scraps were hardly worth the effort. Still, it gave him a small sense of comfort that life persisted here, a tiny triumph in a place that seemed so desolate. As he walked, each step felt a little more manageable than the last. The stiffness in his limbs loosened slightly with movement, though the open gashes and deeper wounds throbbed without pause. Blood had clotted along his flank and legs, leaving crusted patches of dried crimson against his coat. The night's ordeal had left him battered, but he clung to the notion that he was still alive. Where there was life, there was hope. The sky grew brighter, turning a purple-blue that gradually bled into pink along the horizon. He marveled at the subtle shift of color. It was so easy for him to appreciate now, after the suffocating darkness and the terror of the burning trailer. Each new color was a reminder that he had made it through one of the longest nights of his life. Birds began their morning calls, a chorus of chirps and trills echoing through the canyon. He flicked his ears in their direction, sensing the life that was starting to stir. But he had to remain vigilant. Canyons like this were home to predators, wolves, cougars, maybe even bears that hunted the rocky foothills. And he was injured, an easy target if he let his guard down. His nostrils flared, testing the cool air for any sign of danger. A faint shift in the breeze brought no immediate warning scent, but he remained on edge, recalling the instincts taught by generations of wild ancestors. The path he followed narrowed again, forcing him to thread between large boulders that had fallen from the canyon walls above. He struggled past them, occasionally scraping his injured side against the rough stone. A grim determination pushed him forward. He had no notion of how far the canyon extended, but he believed there had to be a way out. Somewhere beyond these cliffs and rocky trails, the land would open up to the wide expanse he remembered. The question was whether his body would hold out long enough to get there. At last, he emerged from the narrow defile into a small valley enclosed by towering cliffs. A trickle of water ran through the center, forming a shallow stream that sparkled in the morning light. Relief flooded him at the sight. His throat felt like it would crack from dryness, and the sound of running water was like music to his ears. He hobbled as quickly as he could to the stream's edge and lowered his head, letting the cool water lap against his muzzle. Careful not to rush, he took shallow sips at first, feeling the liquid soothe his parched mouth and throat. He drank until he felt some measure of life return to his limbs. The water washed the dryness from his tongue, though it did little to ease the ache in his body. Still, it was a gift that came at exactly the right moment. He stepped further in, letting the water flow around his ankles, cleansing the dust and dried blood from his hooves. He lifted his head, droplets glistening on his muzzle. For a moment, he felt almost peaceful, if not for the searing pain that lingered in every joint. But peace was fleeting. A movement on the opposite bank caught his eye. His ears swiveled, heart pounding as he locked his gaze onto a shape that darted behind a boulder. Adrenaline shot through him, reminding him how vulnerable he was. He stood perfectly still, muscles tense, water dripping from his legs. Whatever was out there, it had moved quickly. The shape appeared again briefly, a flash of fur, low to the ground. Could it be a coyote? A wolf? He couldn't tell from just that fleeting glimpse. Either way, the presence of a predator spelled danger, especially for a wounded horse. He backed away from the stream, his hind hooves clawing at the muddy bank as he tried to gain solid footing. Silence descended, broken only by the burble of the water and the distant call of a bird overhead. The shape didn't reappear. Still, he remained poised to flee or fight, breathing hard. Then the wind shifted, carrying the faintest trace of a musky scent. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote, there was something else there, something heavier. A mountain lion, perhaps? His heart hammered. A mountain lion would see him as an easy meal in his weakened state. A minute crawled by like an hour. The Mustang surveyed the area, scanning every rock, every patch of brush. He saw nothing else move, heard no growls, no rustling. Maybe the creature had moved on. Or maybe it was stalking him, waiting for the right moment. He couldn't linger here indefinitely. If he wanted to survive, he needed to keep moving, find a vantage point, and stay away from tight spaces that could trap him. He forced himself up the opposite bank, stepping onto a narrow patch of grass. It was thin and wilted, but he tugged at it, swallowing a few bites of the bitter blades. It was hardly the lush grazing he longed for, but it would stave off the worst of his hunger. His leg throbbed dully, reminding him that rest was just as important as moving. In the wild, however, rest could invite death if chosen at the wrong time. After a moment's deliberation, he set out, following the stream as it wound between the high canyon walls. The ground here was relatively level, and the running water might lead him to an exit. Each step was a jolt of discomfort, but he grit his teeth against the pain. He was a survivor, built to endure harsh conditions. Besides, he had no other choice. Stopping wasn't an option. The presence of a predator had rekindled his fear. Fear was painful, but it also kept him alive. He waded through the shallow water when the bank narrowed, feeling the cool current swirl around his legs. The morning light was brighter now, and he could see the canyon in all its rugged glory, towering walls of layered rock, crowned by hardy shrubs and stunted trees. Every so often, a hawk or eagle circled overhead, scanning for prey. He was grateful they weren't large enough to pose a threat. His mind returned to the silent shape he had glimpsed earlier, wondering if it still followed. As he pushed on, the sound of the stream grew louder, rushing more vigorously. Up ahead, he spotted a small waterfall cascading down from an overhang, feeding the stream he followed. The noise of the falling water masked everything else. If a predator lurked nearby, he wouldn't hear it approach. His ears perked and rotated, scanning for any unusual sound, but all he got was the roaring splash. He navigated around the waterfall, slipping a few times on the wet rocks. Water sprayed his wounded side, eliciting a hiss of pain. But in the midst of that discomfort, he realized something. The water was also gently cleansing the dirt and blood from his injuries. As he passed, he pressed himself briefly against the cascading water, letting the cold flow wash over him. It stung, but it also brought a measure of relief to the raw wounds. He snorted in surprise at the sharpness of the sensation, but forced himself to endure it, hoping to reduce the risk of infection. Out here, even a small cut could fester into something deadly. Continuing onward, he found that the canyon gradually opened up. The walls sloped outward, revealing more sky. The scattered shrubs and wiry grasses became a bit thicker. It lifted his spirits to see signs of life, birds hopping among the stones, small lizards scurrying away. He caught a glimpse of a flash of color, maybe a fox or some other creature darting across a rocky outcrop. None of them approached him. He was too big, too strange, and possibly too dangerous in their eyes. Yet he remained very much aware of his own vulnerability. If a mountain lion decided to take him down, his injuries would make him an easier target. His heart pounded at every unexpected noise, and he found himself constantly checking over his shoulder. But if the predator was out there, it was choosing to stay hidden, perhaps waiting for a better opportunity. The Mustang shook off the thought. Dwelling on it would only paralyze him with fear. And fear could be more dangerous than any predator if it kept him from doing what he needed to survive. Hours seemed to pass as he navigated the canyon floor. The sun rose higher, warming the rocks underfoot. The dryness of the air reminded him of the high desert he'd known. This gave him hope that the terrain might soon shift to more open land if he continued onward. The Mustang found a small patch of grass near a larger boulder, still moist from a seep of water. He grazed for a short while, replenishing a fraction of his spent energy. At last, he spotted a slope on the western side of the canyon that looked more gradual than the sheer walls he'd encountered thus far. Rock layers formed a kind of natural stairway, leading toward the rim. It would be a tough climb, especially in his condition, but it looked far more doable than any path he'd seen before. With a determined snort, he started up, finding footholds where the stone jutted out in steps. Each level he ascended gave him a slightly broader view of the canyon below. The sun glinted off the stream, and from this vantage, he could see the harsh lines of the rocky ravine. It was a place of danger, but also of stark beauty. A memory came unbidden, the first time he had ventured into rocky hills with his mother, stumbling over loose stones, learning to find safe ground. He had been just a colt, still full of boundless energy. Now, battered and alone, he clung to that memory, using it as a shield against despair. He had to stop several times during the climb to catch his breath. His injured leg threatened to buckle more than once, sending him skidding on the loose gravel. Each time he recovered, adrenaline spiked through him, fear that he might tumble to his death. But he refused to let that happen, pressing forward with gritted determination. The wind picked up as he climbed higher, tugging at his mane and tail, carrying the scent of dusty stone and sun-baked earth. He was getting closer to the top, though it still felt agonizingly far. At last, after what felt like hours, he hauled himself over the final rock ledge. He nearly collapsed onto the sandy ground, panting heavily. Sprawled on the ground, he took several moments to catch his breath, sweat lathering his flanks. His head was light, vision a bit blurred. But he was at the top, in the open. A vast sky stretched overhead, dotted with sparse white clouds. For a moment, he simply lay there, feeling the sun's warmth on his battered body. Then he raised his head and looked out at the horizon. It wasn't the broad, sweeping plain he remembered, but it was more open, with rolling desert hills stretching toward the distance. Scrub brush and cactus dotted the sandy terrain, and far away, he could see darker outlines that might be mountains. It wasn't perfect, but it was freedom compared to the cage of canyon walls. He inhaled deeply, relishing the sense of space. Gingerly, he rose to his feet, ignoring the protests of his muscles. A breeze stirred, cooling the sweat on his sides. He scanned the landscape, searching for any sign of immediate threat, any predator lurking among the rocks. Nothing moved within sight. For the first time since the crash, he felt a touch of safety. Here, at least, he could see danger coming from a distance. He could find a place to rest if he needed to, though he still worried about water and food. He started forward, picking his way carefully across the sandy ground. The dryness reminded him of his thirst, but he had drunk from the stream not long ago. Hopefully, it would be enough to sustain him until he found another source. The terrain rolled gently, dotted with boulders and the occasional hardy desert plant. Despite the wide open space, the Mustang couldn't quite shake the tension in his nerves. The memory of the trailer wreck still clawed at his mind, reminding him how quickly fate could turn. As midday sun rose high and bright, he noticed something in the distance, a swirl of dust, as if disturbed by movement. He halted, ears pricked, straining to see what it was. After a moment, he caught sight of several dark shapes moving along a distant ridge. Horses. A small group of them, from the look of it, though they were too far away to be certain. His heart leapt at the possibility of reuniting with others of his kind. But caution tempered his excitement. He was wounded and alone, and he knew nothing of their intentions. Domesticated horses might be guarded by ranchers, or they might be wild and wary. Still, the pull of companionship was strong. Horses were herd animals by nature. After his harrowing ordeal, the idea of seeing another living creature of his own kind, hearing their snorts, their hooves on the ground, was both thrilling and terrifying. He hesitated, uncertain if he should approach or find a more discreet path. But loneliness and desperation nudged him forward. He set off, limping but resolute, angling his path so he might intercept them. The dust swirled again, hinting that they might be moving on. He feared losing sight of them entirely. Each step sent spikes of pain through his leg, but he pressed on, determined to at least see if these were truly horses and if so, whether they posed any threat or could offer some form of safety. The land dipped and rose, occasionally obscuring his view. He quickened his pace as best he could, though it was more of a stagger than a gallop. Sweat trickled down his face, stinging the cuts along his brow. The sun was relentless, beating down with a merciless glare. Every muscle and bone in his body cried out for rest, but he couldn't bear the thought of letting this chance slip away. He felt like an exile seeking the faint promise of belonging. Then he crested a small rise and saw them more clearly. A group of 5 horses, their coats shining in the midday light. They looked lean and hardy, like survivors of the desert. A chestnut mare raised her head, ears perked in his direction. Another, a buckskin stallion, eyed him warily. The others shifted, uncertain. They had formed a loose cluster near a stand of hardy shrubs, possibly nibbling on what little forage they could find. The Mustang slowed his approach, sensing their tension. He let out a low, soft nicker, an attempt at a friendly greeting, but one tinged with weariness. The buckskin stallion snorted, stomping a hoof as if to warn him to keep his distance. The chestnut mare flicked her tail nervously. The Mustang paused, head bowed slightly, showing he meant no harm. He was in no condition to fight. He just needed somewhere to rest, maybe even a chance to travel with them for a while. Safety in numbers. A glimmer of hope sparked within him that maybe they would accept him, or at least tolerate him until he recovered enough to move on. But they were wild or possibly feral. Trust wasn't freely given in this harsh environment. He inched closer, each step slow and cautious. The stallion tossed his head, pawing at the ground as if deciding whether to charge or retreat. The Mustang didn't challenge him, keeping his posture low and unthreatening. He wanted them to see his wounds, his exhausted stance, so they might understand he wasn't a threat. Time stretched. The wind rustled dry shrubs, and a crow cawed overhead. Finally, the stallion snorted and turned slightly, not fully relaxing but no longer poised to attack. The mare regarded the newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The Mustang took this as a tentative welcome and limped forward a few more steps. He felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled his legs. He lowered his head, inhaling the scent of the other horses, letting them catch his own scent in return. This was a delicate ritual of introduction in the wild. The chestnut mare stretched her neck forward, sniffing in his direction. He remained still, heart hammering, as she made contact, her nostrils flaring. She jerked back slightly, startled by the metallic smell of dried blood and the stench of the crash that clung to him. The stallion pinned his ears, suspicious. The Mustang let out a quiet whicker, trying to communicate his desperation. He needed them, even if just for a moment, to not drive him away. Cautiously, the chestnut approached again, more slowly this time. She caught his scent thoroughly, and though she remained tense, she didn't flee. The others seemed to sense he wasn't an immediate threat. The stallion stamped his foot once more, then moved a short distance away, turning sideways in a posture that indicated reluctant acceptance, as long as the newcomer didn't cause trouble. The Mustang exhaled a shaky breath. He stood among them, battered and bleeding, but no longer entirely alone. Despite their wariness, there was a warmth in knowing he was once again in the presence of his own kind. For now, it was enough. Even if they drove him off eventually, these precious moments of safety and rest felt like a lifeline. He lowered his muzzle to the ground, nibbling at the sparse tufts of grass at his feet. It was bitter and dry, but it was nourishment. He could almost feel his strength returning, if only slightly. The day wore on, the sun climbing higher before eventually tilting westward. The small band of horses grazed intermittently and moved at a casual pace, never straying too far from him, but always maintaining a comfortable distance. Occasionally, the stallion would glance at him, ears pricked, as if to remind the newcomer of who was in charge. The Mustang lowered his gaze submissively each time. He had no desire to challenge. His only desire was to heal and survive. As shadows lengthened across the desert floor, the Mustang found himself moving alongside the group, drawn by an unspoken pull. The chestnut mare seemed the least wary of him, occasionally drifting closer to assess his state. He let her see his wounds, trusting the primal empathy shared by their species. She didn't venture too near, but she no longer shied away completely. It was a tentative truce. Night began to approach, painting the sky with oranges and purples. Instinctively, the small band sought a sheltered spot near a rock outcropping. The Mustang followed, limping behind. They settled in, some standing guard while the others took turns dozing. The stallion stood watch most vigilantly, ears swiveling, eyes scanning the darkening horizon. The Mustang, too, tried to remain alert, but weariness weighed him down. His wounds throbbed without mercy. Once he had a family, a herd that knew him by sight and smell, that protected him as he protected them. That was gone now, stolen by men who saw them as a commodity. Yet, here in the waning light, he found a fragile sense of community, even if temporary. He closed his eyes for brief moments, fighting the urge to drift away completely. He had to stay awake, to remain ready for anything that might slink through the darkness. But the night was surprisingly peaceful. A mild wind blew across the desert, rustling the sparse vegetation. The stallion stood silent vigil, occasionally flicking his tail to swat at a persistent insect. The chestnut mare dozed but opened an eye whenever he shifted. The Mustang felt a wave of gratitude for their presence, for the acceptance they offered him, however guarded. He wondered if they had ever been near humans or witnessed the roundups that claimed so many Mustangs. Perhaps they, too, had known the crack of a whip or the sting of a rope. As the stars emerged in their full brilliance, he caught himself slipping into a light sleep, lulled by the presence of others and the relative safety of their small group. His dreams were unsettled, flashes of the trailer's twisted wreck, the roaring flames, and the dead eyes of horses that hadn't survived. But beyond that darkness, he sensed the memory of open grasslands bright as day, calling him back to a home he feared he might never see again. He jerked awake at some unknown hour, heart pounding. The others still stood or rested near him, unconcerned. The chestnut mare looked at him with mild curiosity, as if wondering what nightmares haunted him. The Mustang sighed, lowering his head once more. He realized with a certain sadness that while these horses had offered him short-term solace, he was still an outsider, a wanderer with no real herd. Healing would take more than physical mending. It would require the sense of belonging he had lost. With that thought lingering, he tried to return to his restless half-sleep, determined to take advantage of any moment of rest while it was safe. Tomorrow would bring new trials. He might follow this band for a while, or he might strike out on his own, searching for something he couldn't name. Above them, the desert sky glittered with infinite stars, and somewhere in that vast universe, perhaps there was a small glimmer of hope for a horse who refused to surrender to fate. At first light, a faint pink glow heralded the dawn. The horses stirred, yawning in their equine way, stretching necks and shaking manes. The Mustang blinked gritty eyes, exhaustion still clinging to him like a heavy blanket. But he sensed the forward motion of the group as they began to move, searching for better grazing, for water, or simply wandering as wild horses often do. He followed at a respectful distance, each step a reminder that his injuries were far from healed. The chestnut mare allowed him to approach her flank, flicking an ear in his direction but not moving away. The stallion glanced back but didn't charge him or pin his ears, which the Mustang took as a sign he could remain for now. He knew better than to test the stallion's patience. The small band journeyed across rolling hills of desert scrub, the sun creeping higher and bringing with it a dry heat. The Mustang's throat grew parched again, and he longed for another stream or oasis. The hours passed in a slow trek, hooves clicking on scattered stones, the air filled with the faint scent of sage. Every so often, they stopped to nibble on patches of wiry grass or to scrape at the ground in search of hidden roots. The Mustang did the same, though his appetite was dulled by pain. As midday approached, they reached a cluster of larger rocks where the horses paused in the shade to rest. He used the time to check his wounds as best he could, licking at a few spots to remove dried blood. The chestnut mare watched him, her gaze surprisingly gentle. She took a few tentative steps toward him, lowered her head, and sniffed near one of his injuries. He stood stock still, letting her investigate. Her warm breath tickled his flank. It wasn't a gesture of full trust, but it was a crack in the barrier between them. The stallion stood off to the side, half dozing yet still aware of everything around him. The other 3 horses, a gray mare, a sorrel gelding, and a dark bay mare, milled about, occasionally glancing at the newcomer. The Mustang could sense they were all aware he was different. That he carried a scent of men, of smoke, of something terrible. Yet none of them attacked or drove him away. Perhaps they recognized a wounded soul in need of mercy, or maybe they just didn't perceive him as a threat. Regardless, he was grateful. Eventually they set off again, drawn by the promise of water or better forage. The Mustang trudged behind them, sometimes lagging due to his injured leg. He worried they might leave him behind if he fell too far behind, but they never quite did. Their pace was steady, unhurried, as if they had nowhere pressing to be. The day became a haze of heat, dust, and slow, plodding travel. By late afternoon, the horizon revealed a thin line of green, a sign of vegetation that likely indicated water. The Mustang felt a surge of excitement, ignoring his pain to keep pace. If they found a decent water source, he could clean his wounds properly, drink his fill, and perhaps finally let his body rest enough to start real healing. The chestnut mare tossed her head, quickening her steps as the others followed suit. The band clearly recognized the promise of water, too. The green line turned into a meandering creek flanked by willows and cottonwoods. The sight of those lush trees in the desert felt like a revelation. The horses made their way down a gentle slope to the water's edge, hooves squelching in the damp soil. They drank greedily, and the Mustang did the same, plunging his muzzle into the cool water. The sensation of the liquid sliding down his parched throat was pure bliss. He gulped mouthful after mouthful, pausing only to catch his breath. Then he waded further in until the water reached his knees, letting it swirl around the cuts and bruises. The stallion eyed him but didn't interfere. The chestnut mare also stepped into the creek, sending ripples across the surface. For a moment, the Mustang closed his eyes, letting the gentle current soothe his aches. He could almost forget the crash, the screaming flames, the smell of death. Here, water flowed over him with a kind of cleansing grace, washing away some portion of the nightmare. After drinking their fill, the small band spread out along the bank to graze on the lush grass growing near the creek. The Mustang did the same, pulling at the sweet stalks, letting the nourishment bolster his strength. The pain in his leg was still acute, but at least now he had a full stomach and the chance to rest in relative safety. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He wondered if this place might be safe enough to stay for a day or two, just to gather enough strength to heal. That night, the horses settled near the creek, munching contentedly. Crickets and frogs provided a soothing chorus as darkness fell. The Mustang stood close to the chestnut mare, who seemed to have accepted him more than the others. Occasionally, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, he found a measure of comfort. It was as though she understood, at least in part, the trauma he had endured. She might not know the details, but horses were perceptive creatures when it came to suffering. The stallion, on the other hand, remained cautious. He patrolled the perimeter of their little gathering, ears flicking, tail swishing. The Mustang respected his authority, keeping a respectful distance. He had no ambition to challenge or disrupt the band's hierarchy. His only ambition was to survive and possibly regain enough strength to live freely again, unburdened by the specter of what almost claimed him. Over the next few days, a tentative routine formed. The band stayed close to the creek, moving a mile or two each day but never going too far. The Mustang's leg began to heal slowly, scabbing over where the gashes had been. He would still limp, but with each sunrise, the aches seemed a bit less severe. He found himself grazing more and more, gaining back some lost energy. The chestnut mare became a calming presence, sometimes standing near him as he drank or rested. He'd catch the stallion watching them, but it never escalated into a confrontation. He didn't know how long this acceptance would last, but for now, it was a precious gift. The Mustang could sense that fate had intervened the night of the crash. He was supposed to be slaughtered, discarded as though his life held no value. Yet here he was, breathing the warm desert air, chewing fresh grass, feeling the pulse of freedom in his veins once more. He spent hours just walking along the creek, letting the water lap at his legs, letting the sun bake away the last remnants of the trailer's stench. Sometimes he'd jerk awake at night, the image of the burning wreck still vivid in his mind. The screams of the other horses echoed in his nightmares, their fears seared into his memory. In those moments, he would stand alone under the moon, gazing at the sleeping figures of his temporary herd, grateful he had made it out alive but haunted by guilt that he couldn't save the others. He wondered how many had escaped. How many lay still at the bottom of that ravine. The realization that he might be the only survivor weighed heavily on his heart. But such thoughts had to be put aside for the demands of daily survival. The desert was unforgiving, and each day brought challenges: extreme heat, potential predators, the need to find water and shelter. The band, though small, had a collective wisdom that the Mustang leaned on. He followed their cues, learning which plants were safe to eat, where to find shade, and how to detect trouble in the shifting winds. A week passed, maybe more. The Mustang's wounds formed firm scabs, and while his leg still wasn't at full strength, he was now able to trot without collapsing. He felt a stirring in his soul, a restlessness that reminded him of the wild energy he once had. The chestnut mare acknowledged this by running short distances, testing him to see if he would join. He did, tentatively at first, favoring his leg, but each time he found it a bit easier to move, to trust his body again. One evening, as twilight settled and the band grazed near a gentle bend in the creek, he felt a subtle shift in the group's mood. The stallion was anxious, pacing and sniffing the air. The maras huddled closer, tails swishing, eyes scanning the tree-line. The Mustang lifted his head, ears pricked. A strange scent drifted toward them on the breeze, faint but unmistakably that of humans. Instantly, adrenaline spiked in his veins, memories of captivity flooding his mind. He looked to the band for guidance, but he already knew what would happen. Wild horses had an ingrained fear of humans, who brought ropes and fences. The stallion nickered sharply, herding the maras into a tighter formation. The Mustang's heart hammered. He didn't know if it was a single human, a party of them, or something else entirely. But the thought of falling into another trap, another trailer, was unbearable. The band took off at a canter, heading deeper into the desert away from the creek. The Mustang followed, ignoring the twinge in his leg. Better to run injured than be caught. Hooves pounded the earth, dust rising in a cloud. The chestnut mare glanced at him, as if encouraging him to keep up. He found himself matching their pace, the rush of wind in his ears, the drum of his heart echoing with each stride. Darkness spread across the sky, the stars emerging one by one. The group didn't slow for miles, pushing themselves to distance from the scent of humans. Only when their lungs burned and sweat lathered their coats did they allow themselves a moment's respite near a rocky ridge. The Mustang nearly collapsed, muscles quivering from the exertion. But he felt alive in a way he hadn't since the crash, running with the herd, hooves striking the earth in unison, united by the instinct to remain free. They huddled in the darkness, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. None came. Perhaps the humans were just passing through, or perhaps they were searching for something else. Regardless, the band had chosen flight over risk, and the Mustang was grateful. The memory of the slaughterhouse trailer was too fresh. He had narrowly escaped that fate, and he had no desire to test his luck again. He realized he was breathing heavily beside the chestnut mare, their flanks nearly touching as they drew in the cool night air. She turned her head to regard him, her eyes reflecting moonlight. For a moment, he sensed a connection that transcended their circumstances. She was wild, he was wild, both survivors in a harsh world. He gently bumped her muzzle with his own, a sign of gratitude and solidarity. She blinked, accepting the gesture. The stallion, only a few yards away, let out a low snort but didn't intervene. Perhaps he sensed there was no threat in that moment, only shared relief. Late into the night, they remained vigilant, but no further sign of humans appeared. Gradually, they relaxed enough to graze on the sparse vegetation. The Mustang's mind whirled with conflicting emotions. Relief that they hadn't been caught, mixed with the fear that one day he might not be so fortunate. He thought of the trailer wreck again, the smell of burning flesh and twisted metal. He thought of how close he came to oblivion, how fate had taken a stunning turn that night, granting him another chance. In the weeks that followed, the Mustang grew stronger. He learned the rhythms of the band, understood the subtle cues of the stallion. Though never fully integrated, he was tolerated. The chestnut mare allowed him the occasional nuzzle, a sign that his presence had become something she accepted. The others, too, seemed to respect him enough not to chase him off, though they kept a slight distance. He was content to be on the periphery of their family, a shadow that drifted in their midst, gleaning safety and companionship. Yet, as his leg healed and his energy returned, a restlessness began to stir within him again. He found himself gazing at the horizon, haunted by the memory of the open plains he once called home. The band stuck to this desert region, following seasonal water sources, but he felt a pull to roam farther, to seek out the place where he was born. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wander a short distance from the group, gazing at the stars, half expecting to hear familiar calls on the wind. One day, after a light drizzle had passed and the desert glistened with brief moisture, he made his decision. The band was scattered across a broad plateau, nibbling on fresh shoots that had sprouted overnight. The chestnut mare was near him, swishing her tail idly. He nudged her gently in farewell, letting out a soft nicker. She froze, as if sensing the shift in his intentions. Her ears flicked, and she returned a quiet sound, a question. He didn't have the words, but he had to go. His spirit yearned for something beyond these hills. He turned away, walking slowly at first. She watched him, took a step forward as if to follow, but then the stallion called her back with a sharp neigh. The Mustang didn't look back again. Despite the ache in his chest, he continued on, each stride fueled by a longing that outstripped any sense of fear. He had been granted a second chance, and he intended to use it to find his true home, or at least the freedom that echoed in his memories. The desert stretched before him, vast and daunting. But he was no longer the broken, terrified creature who crawled from the trailer wreck. His body bore scars, yet his spirit felt renewed. Each breath tasted of possibility, each step carrying him closer to a destiny he would shape himself. He might wander alone, or he might find a new herd, or maybe he'd be reunited with remnants of the one he'd lost. Whatever awaited him, he faced it with the steady resolve of a survivor. Days turned to nights, nights turned to days. He navigated by the sun and stars, guided by an internal compass that whispered of grasslands and open skies. Occasionally, he encountered other small bands of horses, or glimpsed distant lights that signaled human settlements. He avoided people whenever possible, the trauma of captivity still too raw. His leg grew stronger, though it never stopped reminding him of its injury. On some days he could manage a strong canter, on others he had to limp carefully, mindful not to aggravate the old wound. The land changed subtly as he traveled, the desert giving way to rolling foothills where shrubs grew thicker. He found more streams, more patches of grass, even the occasional orchard fence belonging to a ranch. He had to be cautious around these, for men often guarded their lands with guns or dogs. But sometimes, at night, he'd slip through a gap in a fence to graze on succulent grass, recharging his reserves before moving on. A small, guilty thrill accompanied these forays into human territory, but hunger overrode the fear. Occasionally, he spotted a lone stallion roaming, or the flicker of movement that signaled a band of wild horses. He kept his distance, unsure whether they would welcome him. Some might be protective of their territory or suspicious of a stranger carrying the scent of men. Other times he allowed himself to be seen, but no one challenged him outright. He was still in relatively rough shape, perhaps not worth the trouble of driving away. It was a lonely existence, but each day he felt a surging hope that he was closer to what he sought. Then, one glorious morning, as he crested a hill at sunrise, he saw it, a vast plain stretching out toward the horizon, grass swaying gently in the golden light. His heart leapt at the sight. This was the world he remembered, the place where mustangs thundered across the land without chains or fences. He inhaled deeply, scenting the sweet fragrance of grass. It was still miles away, separated by rugged terrain, but he recognized it as home. He descended the slope, pushing through pain and weariness, nearly delirious with the promise of freedom. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the rolling sea of grass. In the distance he spotted movement, a large herd of horses. His breath caught. There were too many to count, their hides painted in shades of chestnut, bay black, roan, and palomino. It was a sight that made his heart pound like a wild drum. Could this be his old herd, or a new one that might take him in? Cautiously he approached. At first, the herd was just a blur of shapes, but as he drew nearer, details emerged: the proud stance of the lead stallion, the watchful eyes of broodmares, the dance of young foals around their mothers. They grazed in a broad area, heads dropping to the lush grass. Some snorted or nickered, shifting positions, but no alarm was raised yet. He approached from downwind, letting his scent drift toward them. They would know he was coming. Before long, a lookout stallion trotted forward, ears pricked, tail raised, announcing the stranger's presence. The Mustang paused, letting the stallion see that he meant no harm. He lowered his head, offering a submissive posture. The lead stallion, a powerful black, cantered closer, nostrils flaring as he took in the newcomer's scent. A few other horses followed, curious. Tension crackled in the air, the possibility of confrontation bristling in every flick of an ear. The Mustang held his ground, standing calmly, inviting their inspection. They sniffed him, prodded his flank, perhaps taking in the remnants of the trailer's stench and the healing wounds that marred his hide. He caught a few snorts of curiosity, some whickers. Then, from within the mass of horses, a mare appeared, her coat a rich dun with a jagged blaze down her face. She nickered softly at him, eyes wide with recognition. A jolt of shock went through him. He remembered that face, that scent, from his youth. She was from his original herd. She stepped forward, ears pricked in disbelief, and pressed her muzzle to his neck. He exhaled in a trembling sigh, returning the gesture. The lead stallion, seeing this, backed off slightly, no longer viewing him as an immediate threat. There was confusion among the others, but the mare's acceptance signaled that he was part of their history. She let out a series of short, excited whinnies, and several others trotted over, whinnying in reply. The Mustang's eyes glistened with relief. He had found them, at least, some part of the herd he'd known before men came with ropes and prods. The reunion was bittersweet. He recognized some faces, saw that others were missing. Time had changed them all. But it was a homecoming he never dared believe would happen. Horses crowded around him, sniffing, licking his wounds, welcoming him back in the only way they knew how. He felt a deep ache in his chest, remembering the fiery night, the smell of death, the countless miles he had wandered alone. But now, among these familiar scents and gentle nudges, he knew he was no longer a castaway. He remained with the herd that day, letting the memories and sensations wash over him. There were new foals, skittish yet curious, that pranced around him before darting back to their mothers. Old friends with scars of their own nuzzled him, as if acknowledging the struggles he must have endured. He found himself dozing in the warmth of the afternoon sun, surrounded by the soft rustle of grass and the low murmur of equine conversation. For the first time since the terror of the trailer, his heart felt whole. He took the time to heal further, grazing on the lush grass, running gentle sprints with the younger horses to build up his strength, forging new bonds. Whenever he felt the creeping horror of his nightmares, he reminded himself he was safe here. The slaughterhouse was a distant memory, the canyon a closed chapter. Fate had indeed taken a stunning turn, delivering him from certain death to the open plains where he belonged. Some days he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The band of desert horses that had offered him shelter, the chestnut mare who showed him compassion, the countless dangers that tested his will. Each challenge had shaped him, forging a resilient spirit that refused to be broken. In the presence of his old herd, his confidence grew. He was no longer the terrified horse pinned beneath twisted metal in a ravine. He was a survivor, tempered by fire and darkness, now standing beneath the wide sky, free. As the sun set one final time on his memories of the crash, he stood atop a grassy knoll, watching the horizon blaze with oranges and purples. Around him, the herd grazed peacefully, an unspoken sense of unity connecting them. He raised his head high, inhaling the cool evening breeze. A sense of profound gratitude welled within him, gratitude for the chance to live, to run, to share in the wild communion of his kind. Though he bore scars that would never fully fade, they were a testament to his strength and the promise of tomorrow. If this story moved you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this incredible journey of survival and resilience. We upload new stories every day at the same time. Don't miss the next one. Thank you for being here, and remember, sometimes, fate can turn even the darkest moments into a path toward freedom.